Hello there, you're welcome to His God TV. My name is Collins Nanaya Abebrese. So, in this video, we are going to look at the colonial policy of indirect rule, which was adopted by the British in Ghana. And basically, we are going to look at the reasons for the opposition of indirect rule by the educated elite. So, why the educated elite in the colony decided to oppose the indirect rule system, why they did not agree with the British in its implementation. And that is what we are going to look at in this lesson. Previously, we have learned, or I have done some videos on the Bond of 1844, as well as George Maclean's activity in the Gold Coast. And so, if you care to know, you can check that in the playlist in the SHS3. You'll find them there. But before we even begin with our discussions, I would also like to remind you to subscribe to this channel. We have a twin channel called Nana Collins TV, and it's also basically the same thing, but here we are doing a more refined videos of our previous videos that we have done on Nana Collins TV. So if you see both channels, for His Gov and Nana Collins, do not forget to subscribe. And so today we are looking at the reasons why the indirect rule was opposed by the educated elite. And the educated elite today would be the politicians, those who had had education or some form of Western education in those days. And those were the people that we called educated elite. So anytime you hear me say educated elite, I'm referring to the people in the colony that had had some form of education, formal education, and they were considered as educated elite. And so this policy was not, agreed upon by these educated elite. And so let's dive into our lesson and find out some of the reasons why it was not agreed or they opposed this policy. But before that, let's take a look at our lesson objectives for today. So by the end of this lesson, the first lesson objectives is for us to be able to explain indirect rule as a colonial policy by the British. So by the end of this video, you should be able to explain what do we mean by indirect rule as a colonial policy. Just explain it, Then also you should be able to examine our main focus for today. You should be able to examine why the educated elite opposed the indirect rule policy, which was implemented by the British. So these two main objectives should guide us in our discussions for this lesson. So let's begin with the introduction. And the introduction deals with the meaning of indirect rule. So the question is, what is indirect rule? What is this policy of indirect rule that we are talking about? Now, the indirect rule was a colonial policy of the British government by which African traditional institutions and rulers were used to administer the local areas of the colonies. Thus, the governor ruled the people through the chiefs, who were guided by the district commissioners. That is what indirect rule is all about. It was a colonial policy during the colonial period, which was implemented by the British. Now, there are other videos on the reasons why the British also decided to implement this policy, and so you can also watch that. I think it is on our other channel, Nana Collins TV. Now, they decided to use African traditional institutions and rulers to administer the local areas of the colony. And thus, the colonial governor, in the colony was going to rule the people through the chiefs, and these chiefs were going to be guided by people who would be appointed uh, by the British as a district commissioner. Now, it must be noted that the system would work or survive best in areas where there was centralized political system. All right. There are several reasons why the British decided to adopt this policy. But of course, this was a very cheap policy in terms of expenses. All right. And so the governors or the chiefs, Africans, almost every group of people had a chief or a ruler, a traditional ruler. And so all that this policy sought to do was to rule the people. So the laws, the taxes, the various policies that the British wanted to implement, they pass it on to the district commissioner. Then the district commissioner will then relate it to the chief, because the chief was going to be guided by the district commissioner, and the district commissioner represented of course, the British interest. All right, and so the chiefs were going to be, for guided. So several chiefs will be put under, say, one district, district commissioner. And so that is what the indirect rule policy was all about. You rule the people not directly but indirectly through their chiefs. So the laws that your chiefs may be implementing may be coming from or will be coming from the British. Now let's take a look at now we also said that the policy would best work in areas where there is a chief, a centralized system already, where power emanates or comes from one person, which then means or suggests that Africans had that centralized political system, unlike the narrations that we get from the West, that Africans were barbaric, we were uncivilized, and it was the Europeans or the arrival of the Europeans that brought to us our civilization. This testified that if you want to go by indirect rule, the chiefs must already be recognized by the people that they are ruling before this policy was going to be successful. Now, the British created warrant or artificial chiefs in areas where legitimate chieftaincy institution was lacking. Okay, now there were areas in the colony where it could be a succession dispute, it could be there wasn't any legitimate chief over there. In these areas, the British would appoint a chief, and this chief was called a warrant chief or artificial chiefs. A warrant chief because the chiefs were given a certificate by the British, and this certificate was called warrant, and that is why we call them warrant chiefs. All right. Now, the system of indirect rule was introduced by Lord Frederick Lugard in India and Uganda. So, Lord Frederick Lugard, he was not in Ghana, but when the British were dealing with ways and means to administer their colony, he wrote in the book The Dual Mandate of British West Africa. He wrote in that book, and suggested that the British should adopt the indirect rule system. They should rule the people through their chiefs, because their chiefs were already recognized by the people, and therefore there was no need for the British to reintroduce a new form of governance or politics to the local people. And of course, the local people were going to rebel. So this policy was first introduced in India and also in Uganda, and later it was adopted across the British, colonies. So in West Africa, when we come to West Africa especially, the concept was first introduced by Frederick Lugard in northern Nigeria from 1901. So when we come to West Africa, the indirect rule policy was first introduced in Nigeria, and then when we come to Ghana or the Gold Coast, the system was introduced by Sir Gordon Frederick Guggisberg. They are two different people, Sir Gordon Guggisberg. So that is how the whole indirect rule policy, came about. I hope you understand the meaning of indirect rule policy, and that you will be able to explain what the indirect rule policy is about. So let's then move on to why the educated elite decided to abandon this policy. Now, when the British decided to implement this indirect rule policy, it was opposed by the educated elite, those who had some form of education. They weren't in support of this policy, mainly because of the reasons that we are going to look at. So let's take a look at the first of such reason why the educated elite opposed the indirect rule policy. One was the exclusion of the educated elite. Now, many of the educated elite were excluded from colonial or native administration. All right, they were not employed because they felt that they had been to, by virtue of their education, they have been to school in Britain, some overseas. They, had the required skills and knowledge in governance, in law, in and all sort of things to manage the local administration. However, the British were not employing them to work in the colonial administration, and so because of that, they felt excluded, and so decided, even when they heard that the British were going to rule the people through indirect rule through the chiefs, they then opposed that. And don't forget, Guggisberg first formed the Provincial Council of Chiefs, and that started this whole indirect rule thing. So, for example, most of the members of the Aborigines Rights Protection Society, the ARPS, and the National Congress of British West Africa, the NCBWA, expressed strong opposition to the policy on the grounds that the colonial administration were in favor of the chiefs to the neglect of the educated elite. And this was so because most of the seats that were reserved for the traditional rulers in the various constitutions that we have looked at, which we have videos on, from 1916 to 1925 to 1946, 1954, all the constitutions that were promulgated by the British excluded the educated elite. In some instances, they were given a limited number of seats, which the chiefs were always in the majority. So that is the whole issue. The educated elite felt excluded from native administration, and they felt that by their education they were more qualified to lead the people. Don't also forget that most of these chiefs were not educated, and therefore the educated elite felt that they would become stooges. Now let's take a look at the next reason why the educated elite opposed indirect rule. They also felt that it would retard constitutional development. So the point is retardation of constitutional development. Now, the educated elite saw the system as disturbingly slow because it impeded the constitutional development of the country. It gravely affected the political changes that could have taken place at that time. Now, bear in mind that these educated elite have been to big universities abroad. They have learned law, they have learned politics, they have seen how the West, politics is all done in the West, and so they felt that same should be applied or done in their colonies, in their countries, in the Gold Coast where they were coming from. Okay, and so they felt that the basis of all this was a constitution, because it is a constitution that lays down everything for a country, to come up or to be run or administered on. Now they were looking for a more open, democratic, constitution, because all the constitution that had been promulgated, they were not in support of it. They were constantly, agitating against some of the constitutions that were introduced by the British. And they felt that going by indirect rule was going to retard constitutional development in the country, because then you are not allowing the people to vote or to choose their own leaders, but you are imposing leaders on them. And so this was also a reason why they felt that the indirect rule policy was not the right way to go. Now let's move on to the third point of the indirect rule policy. The third point was that the traditional rulers also became autocratic. The policy encouraged the chiefs to be autocratic because of the powers vested in them under the policy of indirect rule. For example, no chief could be distilled without the express consent of the colonial administration. So most of these chiefs became very autocratic, in the sense that, power, or they derive their powers not from, or their mandate not from the people that they serve, but rather the British had appointed them as chiefs. And so therefore you realize that some of them became autocratic. Bear also in mind that in our traditional political system, a chief was not supposed to be autocratic. You cannot be autocratic because you could be distilled by your people. And so this was also a tendency that the educated elite envisaged that it may happen if this indirect rule is supposed to happen. And even, yes, it was happening. Indirect rule was in force, and some of the chiefs were acting in that way. Don't also forget that the chiefs, some of them derived their power from the British. And if you're a chief and you also fail to, do according to the demands of the British government or the colonial government, you could also be distilled as a chief. And so, all the chiefs were afraid. They were just had to protect, their position. All right. So that is that. Now, the next, but one reason why the educated elite opposed indirect rule was the fact that the traditional rulers were reduced to stooges. You know who a stooge is? You have to check that from a dictionary in case you don't know. A stooge. Now, the chiefs could not take any initiative on their own in their various localities, as they had to take orders from the colonial masters at the expense of the local people. So stooges simply means they were controlled by the British authorities, or by the British colonial administration, colonial masters or governors. So stooges, they couldn't make laws, or they couldn't take decisions or initiatives on their own, but rather they were being controlled from the outside. So sometimes some of the chiefs were forced to do or implement policies that they themselves did not support, but who were them to to complain. And so that is what we meant by stooges. They became stooges. They were they were basically controlled by the Europeans. Now, the last one has to do with undemocratic core principles. Now, the educated elite felt that the implementation of indirect rule was undemocratic. And as I earlier indicated, they have been to school and they have learned all the governance in this world, and they were quite educated, and so they knew that the habit of appointing chiefs into the legislative council was not the right thing to do, because you can't appoint people into a legislative council to make laws, for people or for others. And therefore they felt that people should be elected or voted for before they can represent that group of people. So they felt that this whole idea of indirect rule policy was quite undemocratic. It was not in line with democratic principles. So through the system, the chiefs were granted seats on the executive and the legislative councils. This was strongly criticized by the educated elite as undemocratic because the chieftaincy institution was hereditary, and for that matter, chiefs could not be considered as a true representatives of the people. So this also boils down to the debate where the educated elite were saying that per their education, they were the ones who were supposed to represent the people and not the chiefs. And I don't know what you think of that. Today, would you say that the chiefs should represent, their people either in parliament or you still prefer that we go by the elections that we do have today, where we elect MPs to represent us. So yeah, this is a question. This is of course something for you to think about. You can share your views in the comment section. This brings us to the end of our discussions today. So yeah, thank you very much for your time. Do not forget to share this video, like, comment, and subscribe. Have a nice day. Bye bye.